Welcome to Chandwell. My name's Michael, and this year I'm working on the station end of my inner city viaduct based N-gauge layout, Chandwell. In this video I'm going to show you how I made this overall canopy for Chandwell station using simple materials and easy techniques. I'm going to show you some of the mistakes I made, some of the things I wish I'd done differently, and then also show you how I'm going to fit it into the wider layout down at the station end. As with all my builds, I designed the trusses in Inkscape and I printed them out using normal A4 paper on an inkjet printer. I made a video on how I designed these trusses in Inkscape and I'll link to that at the end if you haven't seen it and you're interested in it. Once it's printed, I glue the paper to card. I'm using a sheet of 0.5mm grey board here that I bought from eBay, so I simply cover the whole sheet in glue stick. It's useful to get down to the level of the gluing so you can see the light reflecting. That just shows you if you've missed any bits, because it's important to cover the whole thing and not to have any bubbles or any bits where the paper starts to peel off from the card once you start cutting it. Once the card is satisfactorily covered in the glue, it's just a case of rolling the paper on. I start at one edge and just roll it down gently. This avoids any air bubbles and it makes sure it goes on nice and smoothly. With this thinner card, the 0.5mm card, it is useful to keep a weight on it while the glue is drying, otherwise it does risk the card curling slightly. So I have 11 of these girders to make, and each one is made of 3 pieces of card. So it's important to get an efficient cutting regime going. So I start with all the horizontal lines in one direction and then all the horizontal lines in the other direction, and what I mean by that is I always cut so that the ruler is on top of the piece of the girder that I want to keep. This just avoids any unwanted bends or tears of the card. I'm using a Swan Morton scalpel with a 10A blade, and thank you to some advice from Timber Surf on his channel, I actually used the same blade for the entire build of this station canopy. I just sharpened the blade on a whetstone every now and again when it needed it. So once all the horizontal lines are done, it's time to move on to the diagonals. When it comes to the diagonals, I try and do all of the ones facing in the same direction at once. So I'm just moving the ruler down the page. I don't want to have to keep moving from side to side around all of the edges of the triangles. As ever, I keep the ruler over the top of the pieces of the girder that I want to keep. Once all the diagonals are done in one direction, I flip it round and do all the diagonals in the other direction, always keeping the piece that I'm keeping underneath the ruler. Once you start joining the ends up, some of the triangles that you've made start flopping out. If that happens, that's a bonus. Happy days, I'll move them to one side, but where the other triangles haven't automatically popped out, I'll leave those for now. The reason being, no matter how careful you are, you always have a little tiny nib of card that holds the triangle in place. I deal with all of these at the end. If you poke them out with your finger, you risk tearing it, and that will either tear through part of the girder or leave a little fuzzy nub of card, which is really difficult to remove. So I do that at the end. So now it's time to remove the triangles. All I do here is just very gently drop the point of the scalpel into the angle of the triangles and just cut through any little nib that's left. This is by far the longest process, so you can see now I'm over an hour into the cutting out of these pieces of triangles. I'm nearly there though, this is the last one. Carefully cut through the little bit of card that's holding this triangle in place. It's a bit of a stubborn one, this one. I've got it stuck at 3 corners, but it's just an easier case of popping it out with this tip of the blade and moving it out. And there we are, 1 hour and 1 minute and 26 seconds, and we have the completed girders. You need to take extra care once it gets like this, because you can see that these bits of card are being held on little lines that are less than a couple of millimeters wide, so you just need to be extra careful here. I often find that once you pinch through the bit that's holding it together, it just pops off, which is good. With one final cut, 1 hour, 19 minutes and 45 seconds since starting, I've got 3 girders cut out. So once the three elements of the girder are cut out, it's just a case of gluing them together. I use standard PVA glue. It's actually children's craft glue from Hobbycraft in a fine tip applicator. I just run the glue across all of the little bits where the girders are going to stick, and then gently place the top bit on top of the middle bit. Flip it round and repeat the process. And you can see the middle bit has got the upright elements of the girder in place, whereas the two outer bits don't. And I did that simply to try and give the whole thing a general 3D appearance. And there we are, the girder is complete, it's glued together. I just use the back of my blade to make sure that the girder is all in alignment, just by wiggling it down. The glue doesn't dry straight away, so you do get a little bit of time to make sure that everything's together correctly. Seem to have been cutting these out forever. I've got 11 girders. They look really good together. I've managed to get them all the right size and shape, and now it's time to start putting them together into some kind of structure that represents an overall station canopy. I'm cutting out some really thin elements, 2mm tall, using standard cornflake packet. And what these will do, these will just help me guide the outer edges of the trusses. Once they're cut, they're long and they're a little bit floppy, but that's okay, I'm only using these as guides. Once that was done, it was a case of cutting out connecting elements. These were made from 1mm card and they were 2mm high. These are going to represent the pieces of the girders that join the main trusses together. I want these to give the impression, once it's finished, of them being one long girder rather than individual pieces. I don't know how successful this is going to be at this point, but that was my plan. So one of my most useful tools are these magnetic mates from York Model Making. They are right angles that are held together with really powerful magnets. And these magnetic mates have got a little cutout circle, which is brilliant for adding glue. Now, if I was using super glue or Uhu or anything like that, I'd just be able to drop it in and then continue. But I'm using standard PVA for everything. I had 5 minutes, so I thought I'd do this bit and get it out of the way. So I just basically drop the PVA onto the join like this. And what that does is, as it dries, it soaks into the card and produces quite a strong bond. So it's just a little dollop like that. And then I'll leave that for an hour or two. Once that has dried, it's still in the clamp there, but the glue has moved in. So I've got all of my girders, I've got my glue, I've got 7 short girders and 4 long girders, and I've got my little slivers of card. It's a little bit like matchsticks. Got a pile of those, and I've got my cornflake packet guides as well. So now we're going to make a start. Here's the first girder with the glue drying, and it's time to go. I'll take this out, it's stuck a little bit to it there, but that's okay, it comes away. So once the right angle clamp is removed, we have a nice right angle join from the serial packet guide bit and the first truss. So I'm going to turn it around, and then what the plan is, I'm going to glue the matchsticks to the inside of the guide bit that's there, and then add the next girder. Add another matchstick to the guide and add another girder, and continue that way until I've got one line of girders done first. So I'm using more magnetic mates just to hold the things upright as I glue. And now we cover the guide in glue and we add the first of the matchsticks, making sure to keep it level with the ground so that everything is stuck to the same level. If you get anything wrong at this point, so if anything's slightly misaligned, once the glue's dried, it'll be very difficult to get it back. And I didn't want to ruin the overall roof at this point. So we've got the first of the matchstick girders in place. It's time to add the next girder. So I just add a little bit of glue to the edge of the girder and then hold it in the right place using another magnetic clamp. Make sure that everything is glued together as squarely and as securely as possible. Once that girder is in place, I add the next connecting piece, and because all of these connecting pieces are measured to exactly the right size, I don't need to add any kind of measuring at this point. I just know that if I add each individual element next to each other, and I hope that it'll just all magically come out at the right size thanks to the width of these little interconnecting pieces that I'm using. So I work along the line like that, adding a connecting piece, then a girder, then a connecting piece, then a girder, all the while using this little bit of floppy cornflake packet as a guide. To help matters along, I also use a Lego right-angled wall. Lego is perfect for this kind of thing. It goes together absolutely square if you use double connecting pieces at the corners like this, and then if we use the little clamps, it keeps everything clamped down and right angled. Before the glue is fully dried, I go back and I drop little dabs of glue on top of the actual joins, and you can see here how it works. You've got the cornflake packet front and the girders on the inside in perfect right angles. By doing this, the glue soaks further into the card, and I find that it makes a really strong bond once it's finally dried. I'm adding an interconnecting piece of the same card spaces in between the lower edges of the triangles. And because I'm using the same size pieces, they do fit in perfectly. So it's just a case of putting a dab of glue on either side and then dropping them into place. I use a heavy square just to keep the pressure together as it goes, and what that means is that as it dries, it'll dry perfectly square because of the joint being in the right place. If all of the pieces of interconnecting card are exactly the same size, it should just magically work out at being right angles. I do keep the Lego frame in place, and I do use the right angle clamps as well, just to make sure that everything is held in place. So I continued like that along the line, adding all the connecting pieces as I go. And you can see here from above that it's starting to look like a roof, and you can see that it is all maintaining its proper square shape. This process continued. You can see here the roof starting to take shape. It's 4 triangles at the back where the station concourse will be, and it's only 3 triangles up here at the front where the platforms are going to be. I'm using the cornflake packet guide on both sides just to hold it all together, and I'm using the heavier metal right angles just to keep a little bit of pressure on as the glue dries to try and keep everything square. These magnetic upright clamps are really good for keeping the whole girder upright, because not only do we need to keep it at 90 degrees to the edges, we need to make sure that it's upright as well. Any one of them flopping down will destroy the overall appearance. So you can see here I'm adding glue to one of the interconnecting pieces, just a little bit of glue on the back, and then drop it onto the cornflake packet guide. And that is the next spacer in place. So once I've got the overall shape of the roof in place, I want to add the larger girders along the centre of 2 of the triangles. These are the girders that are going to run along the centre of the platforms. I want these to look like more substantial girders because they're essentially holding the weight of the entire roof. So for that, instead of it being 2mm thick, I want it to appear to be 3mm thick. So what I'm doing is I've cut a strip of 2mm wide, 1mm thick card, and I'm putting a dab of glue down the centre of each of the triangles that I want to run it. So once the glue's in place, I simply drop the guide on, make sure it's straight, make sure it's stuck down, and once that's in place and that glue is dried, we can flip it over and then start adding a double layer of the spacers on top of that. So I want this to be 2mm thick by 3mm tall. So these little guides here, I'm gluing them back to back. So these are 2mm thick now and 2mm tall square section girders, and they just drop into the gap between the triangles and on top of the guide card that I've already added. Once that all dries, that'll look like a substantial girder running down the centre of the entire roof. So with it all glued together and constructed, it was time to paint the frame. I was actually very surprised at this point by how sturdy the frame was already, considering it's only been held together by little matchsticks of card, and it's easy to move around while painting it. I started with a mid-grey undercoat. I just put this on quite thickly with an old brush, tried to get all of the card covered in this grey. Once that was in place, I used a mix of blue and white paint to make a kind of a duck egg blue kind of colour. Not much of this survives in the finished roof, but I wanted to get it on there just to give a hint of a colour that it might have been painted way back in the past. I put this paint on quite dry. I put the paint onto an old brush and then brushed most of the paint back off onto a piece of paper, and then just dry brushed the whole thing over. This left a lot of the grey shining through, and it just gave a kind of a hint of the colour that might have been there in the past. Once that was dry, I used Humbrol weathering powders. Here I am putting the red oxide colour into the joints of the individual girders that make up the trusses. I wanted to do this to make it look a little bit rusty in the joint areas, as if it's not being maintained very well. The powder goes on really nicely, it's really subtle effect. And in fact, it possibly looks better when you first put it on than when you varnish it, which I did later. Maybe I shouldn't have varnished it, but in the end I did. I make sure I don't have too much on my brush because I don't want to get it everywhere. You have to wear a mask during this process because it is very, very fine, this powder. I used other colours of the weathering powder as well. I used smoke, black, a brown colour. The darker colours, the smoke and the black, I just very, very lightly brushed over the whole thing. What that does is it collects in the crevices and in the joints, and it just makes it look old and dirty in a general kind of manner. Quite like the way that it looks. Once the weathering powders were all in place, I used my usual AK Interactive Ultra Matte varnish, and I brushed this on across the whole thing. What this does is it blends and moves the powders around a little bit. It takes away some of the subtle edges of it, but it does make it look more evenly dirty, if you like. And I quite like the way that it dries. It dries an absolute matte, and the powder is permanently fixed down to the structure. If we take a look at it here, you can see the duck egg blue elements that I haven't weathered yet, and then towards the back is the element that I've done the weathering powder and the varnish to. So you can see that it does look as though some of the joints are a little bit rusty. The overall thing is a little bit dirty, and I think it's an effect that looks well. You won't see much of this because a lot of it will have glazing over the top, so it's more just a suggestion than an absolutely accurate rendition of painted metal. I wanted to have lighting in my roof. To that end, I used 10 warm white wide-angle LEDs, 3mm. I decided what I would do is I would glue them to the rear side of the main girder, the fat girders that run across both of the platforms. So what I did was I tested the LED worked first, and then just used a dollop of Uhu glue, put it into the corner where I was fixing the LED, and then just literally pushed the LED into the dollop of glue. This was a little bit fiddly because I needed to also pull out the legs of the LED so that the wire ran along the beam. But I held it in place for a couple of seconds, and then I used one of my black plastic clamps to hold it in place before moving on to the next one. Once all the 5 LEDs were in place, I soldered them together. The legs of the LEDs didn't quite touch each other, so I had to use a little bit of wire to join them together. But that was straightforward. The wire is just thin enough to be hidden by the girder, so it seemed as though it was going to work alright. It was a little bit fiddly, but I used my black clamps to hold everything in place whilst I worked. I kept testing the LEDs as I went. I just used an old controller and just probed the ends of the wires into place. By keeping the voltage of the controller right down low, I don't need to have the resistors in place at this point, and the LEDs survive the process. I glued the wire down as I went with the Uhu glue, just to keep it absolutely straight against the girder. Continued to test as I went. The LEDs are wired in series. From the positive down at one end, I then have to get the negative wire back to the beginning. The reason why I'm doing the wiring at one end is that these wires will disappear into the station building and be hidden that way, so I don't need to give any thought to complex ways of hiding the wires down the columns or anything like that. The downside of this effect is I have to have an extra wire running all the way back down to the start, which is a little bit difficult to hide, but by threading it through some of the girders like this, it seems to work alright. I would have preferred not to thread it through the girders like that. So on the second one, I realised that if I put the return wire in first, so once that return wire was in place, I simply glued the LEDs in place on top of it. A bit of a fiddly job, but a job of glue and holding it in place with my thumb and then adding a clamp, it kept it in place whilst the glue dried. So this side, this girder, is a lot neater than the original girder because I now don't have the problem of having to thread that wire back. I could have thought ahead and used copper tape or something like that to make it easier, but it's actually worked really well. Don't know why I used white shielded wire rather than black, but I did, and it stuck out like a sore thumb. So I painted the wires black, and I painted the legs of the LEDs black, and I also put a dollop of black paint on top of the LEDs in an attempt to reduce the amount of light that bleeds up out of the top of the roof once it was finished. So onto something entirely new for me. I've never printed onto acetate before. I've ordered this inkjet compatible acetate, and it says here that it's coated on one side and it'll allow the ink to dry immediately. So I'm just testing it with a fountain pen. I'll draw a squiggle on this side. This is the uncoated side, and that ink rubs off completely. So that is not the coated side. Now this side is the coated side. If I put a little squiggle on there, it goes on just as nicely, but it doesn't rub off at all. That ink has dried instantly. So I'm quite confident that this is going to work. I designed the glazing panels in Inkscape, and I tried to fit as many of them onto one sheet of A4 as I could. I'm needing to print them out in individual panels because of the cross beams that go across my roof. I couldn't print out one whole sheet and place it on the roof. Each one has got to be cut and stuck individually. So the brown has come out quite well. The ink is definitely stuck. There's no blurring there at all. It's got an odd kind of sticky feeling to it though. I can't put it on upside down because if you look at it at the back, the black is more of a grey kind of colour, probably because of the coating. So I'm going to have it up the right way around, complete with its kind of weird, resisting, sticky kind of feeling. So when it comes to fitting these, the roof itself, it's warping ever so slightly just as the glue is dried, so I'm going to have to make sure that I keep it in the clamps and press down while I put the glazing on. Here's the first piece that I've done a test fit on. It fits absolutely perfectly. I've just used normal PVA glue to glue it down as well, and it's dried nicely. The glazing doesn't go all the way up to the apex of the roof because there's a louve on the top, which is, I guess, what they used to use to let the smoke and the steam escape from underneath the roof panels. So I'm trying to model that. I'm not putting any detail across the top there because I don't think you'd ever see it once the top is in place. The whole thing is clamped down while the glue dries, and I expect that once all the panels are in place, that will make the roof nice and rigid and not bent. So I continued adding the panels with it in place and with it clamped down. I think with the weathering like this, when all the panels are in place, it's actually going to look more or less how I hoped. So to add the panels then, I cut each one out individually. I had a thick 2mm black border on either edge. That was to glue onto the 2mm thick girders. And I had to cut out a notch to get it underneath those cross members that go across the top. I used normal PVA glue, again it's the Child's Craft glue in a fine tip applicator. And with the right angled Lego clamps in place holding down the roof, I just basically put a line of PVA on the elements of the roof that we're going to hold the glazing in place. The fine tip applicator helps keep just a nice thin bead of glue, and it stops it from going all over the place. It's much easier to work with than Uhu and super glue, and I'll always try to use PVA wherever I can. It's then just a case of very carefully slotting the glazing into place. You need to bend it slightly to get it into the gap, but once it's in, it just naturally falls into position. One thing I started to notice though with this acetate was it's incredibly shiny. This doesn't look like a dirty old roof. This looks like cheap sunglasses. It reflects all of the LED lights that are up in the top of the cupboard pointing down onto the layout. It enhances just how bendy and floppy it is. It doesn't look like glazing, it looks like printed acetate, which is what it is. So at this point I decided to take a bit of a risk. I took my AK Interactive matte varnish, so not the ultra matte, the matte, because it has ever such a slight sheen to it, and I just started brushing it on top of the glazing. It went on and it dried in a really strange way. I think the coating of the acetate reacted with it a little bit, so parts of it dried immediately, other bits stayed in a kind of semi-dry state. But I found that by applying the varnish in the direction of the printed glass panels, it actually started to dry and look like streaky dirt, and it also added a kind of a white sheen to it to make it look like the glazing was frosted rather than absolute see-through. So you can see here it's taking the shine right off the acetate, but it's still see-through. So here we are with the main panels varnished. You can see the difference that it makes. The louve bits that I'm putting on now aren't varnished and they're see-through and very shiny. The main panels, they've got a kind of a dull sheen to them, which is much more realistic. So these top panels I put on in strips. I didn't have to cut them into individual panels because there was nothing for them to thread under. I did have to cut them up a little bit because despite my best efforts, some of the trusses have gone out of alignment by maybe 1mm or 2 in cases. So I had to adjust these strips by chopping them up into smaller bits and overlapping them here and there. But this one's going on as a length of 3 and it's worked really well. So to add detail to the roof, I decided I would add these 2mm strips of what looks like riveted iron across the joins in the glazing, which are currently just black. So to do that, I needed to make sure that these strips were exactly the same colour as the paint that I'd applied, so I wasn't quite sure what colour to go for, so I made this little colour test strip with various different shades of grey. It's difficult obviously to see on the computer screen what will match an actual printed element. So it looks as though this one more or less matches, somewhere between 4 and 5. So I thought, okay, so I want to try and get it exact. So I took 4 and 5, and then I also added the shade that was directly in the middle of those, and I decided to call that shade 4.5. And then eventually I found a colour that I was happy with matched the actual paint that I'd added. That's a good technique of matching the computer printed elements to painted elements. I found this wonderful aged tongue and groove board kind of texture on textures.com, so I used that in Inkscape to produce these end elements for the walls. I originally thought I would do the triangular cut pieces to make them look like little points, but when I actually got this printed and stuck to the Weetabix packet, I realised that each one was actually smaller than 1mm, and there was no way I was going to get my scalpel in there to cut them into individual elements, so I chopped those off. Once they were put together, they were lovely little end boards, and this time I used a different technique for colour matching. This time I mixed white, black and blue paint to try and get a shade that matched the computer printing, and I'm pleased to say that that worked as well. So I painted the edges of the card to remove the white and brown edges. This is the small elements that I used to add detail along the top sides of the roof. And this is the valance itself before I painted the edges. I'd been putting off thinking about the columns for the entire build. It was something that I was looking forward to with a kind of dread. I just didn't know what to do. I didn't want to buy columns because it would work out really expensive, and I don't have a 3D printer or anything like that, so I wanted to make them by hand. The prototype that I was basing it on at Ilkley had square columns with nothing fancy. There was no fancy brackets at the top, so I thought, well, I can make them by card in my usual way. But in the end, I found a box of cocktail sticks in the drawer. It's probably been there for about 20 years. And I thought, well, I'll put these to use. They had a diameter of about 2mm, which seemed about right for what I wanted. And chopped in half, they were 4 centimeters tall, which again was about right. So I took my pin vise and a 1.8mm drill, and I just drilled a small hole in the part of the roof truss where the upright will go. And I was quite pleased that I didn't destroy any part of the roof. I was a little bit nervous at this point with that drill going up into where those 1mm bits of card join the main truss triangle. I hadn't fully decided whether I was going to glue the columns to the platforms and make the roof removable and sit on top of it, or whether I was going to glue the columns to the roof and make the columns removable and sit on top of the platform. But as I played and as I tried this, it began to cement in my head that I was going to glue the columns to the roof and then just let it sit on the platform like this. Once I saw that in place, I thought I was definitely on the right lines. I thought the size of the columns looked about right. The height of the roof looked about right based upon photographs that I'd seen of Ilkley. So I thought I was onto the right thing here and I'd carry on. From this kind of angle down here, I thought that the columns were going to look fine. Seeing the roof like this for the first time, while it's standing up on these 4 bits of cocktail stick, I was starting to get really excited. After all the work that I'd put in, this was the first time I'd actually seen the roof in place. And if I get down here and look upwards out of the roof, I was really excited. It was exactly what I was aiming for. Didn't quite know what to do about the detail on the columns though. At the moment they just looked like cocktail sticks sticking up. So I took a bit of blue tack and I had an experiment, and I thought, well, if I can do something like this, I might be able to make the columns look a little bit more, well, you know, column-like. So with a blue tack test in place, I took some milliput. This is the standard milliput. It comes in 2 pieces, a blue piece and a green piece, and you mix them together. And the act of mixing them together, I guess, activates the epoxy or whatever you'd call it, and it makes a nice kind of clay-like substance which dries rock hard, which can then be filed and painted. So I took my columns, which are basically just chopped in half cocktail sticks, and I took my milliput and I set about trying to turn those into something that resembled actual Victorian station columns. It was a bit of a mess, but it was good fun. Just took a little tiny drop and pushed it onto the end of the column and then rolled it around until it looked something like what I was intending. It was difficult to get them a consistent size and shape, but I did my best across the 22 columns and I got there in the end. So there were my columns. You can see that there was inconsistency in the size of them. Some of them are fatter than others, some of them are taller than others, some of them are more scruffy than others. I really wish I'd done something differently here. I think the columns really let down the overall roof, but it's the way I went and I might look at the columns again in future. I also wanted to try and get the little triangular bits at the top of the columns which join it to the roof. Like I said, at Ilkley they were very straightforward, they weren't very fancy, they just looked a bit like this. So I cut these tiny bits of Weetabix packet and started gluing them together, but I soon noticed that there was inconsistencies with how the cocktail sticks had joined to the roof, so some of them needed to be bigger and smaller than others to make them look like they were consistent. It further began to dawn on me that some of these were going to be absolutely tiny. This one here, I think it's half a 1mm square, so it's about half a square millimetre. It's just ridiculous. At this stage I couldn't control the card was delaminating, and I thought, considering you're never actually going to see this on the layout, it was pointless. So I took them back off again and decided that that was a foolish endeavour. I painted the columns using the same technique as I'd used for the rest of the roof. I undercoated them grey. I then painted them in the same shade of blue that I'd used for the wooden edges. And then I gradually lightened that blue with white paint and started to dry brush it on, just to give a little bit of a feeling of weathered, old aged paint. I was still not happy with the blobs of milliput, which by this point had dried rock hard on the bottom of the columns, so I used a nail file to file them down into a more consistent square kind of profile. But when I first put the canopy down onto the platform with the undercoat on those columns, I was absolutely thrilled. I thought, finally, this roof is looking like I intended. It's going to look good no matter what happens, even with the columns, and I'm really, really pleased with how it's turned out. So the roof has gone onto the layout really nicely. I'm really pleased with how the lights work. They've got that lovely warm kind of dirty yellow kind of look. Although I am not overly happy with the columns, once they're in place they do look okay, especially from this normal viewing angle. You can't tell just how mismatched and how floaty they are above the surface. I think I will go back and readjust how I've done the columns in a future video perhaps. I'm really surprised with just how sturdy the whole thing is. It's very light, it's very sturdy, and it's very rigid. It was rigid from the point that I put the first bits of matchstick style card in place. Really good. It got more and more rigid the more glazing that I added. It's highlighted a little issue. The two bits of platform where I've gone from tarmac to paving haven't properly lined up. I didn't notice that at the point I was doing it, so I'm a bit annoyed with that. It's highlighted that quite a lot, so I might tidy that up at some point as well. So the next step is this back wall. I'm going to put some dark cloud kind of back scene in place, I think, because the sun never shines in Chandwell, as you know, and then work on this back bit. So here is going to be the main station building, or the back of the station building, and I'm going to use some copper tape and some butting out stone just to join the building to the back of the roof of the canopy, so I can get rid of this temporary wiring, and then the copper will just rest on top of the copper base, so I can carry on removing the canopy when I need to and not having to worry about wires trailing, and I can maintain that electrical contact. So I don't know how high the building is going to be yet. This is about just under 2 stories, so it's probably going to be 2 stories. But if you watched the previous video, you'll see that my plan is to make it look as though the ground goes from ground level here to about 4 centimetres over this end, so the ground is going up towards the back of the layout. We'll see how that works. I still haven't decided whether I'm going to model a bridge here or not, so we'll see what that works out like. So that's the plan. If you've liked what I've shown you, please press the thumbs up button in YouTube. If you've got any questions or if you've got any suggestions for what I could have done differently, please use the comments below and let me know. I do value all of your comments, so please keep them coming. My next video will be my February update, so please watch out for that. You'll see what else I've been up to in February. So until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.